Welcome back to the deep dive. Sometimes you look back at a decision and think, what was I thinking?
Mm.
Well, today we're diving into one of those moments on a massive scale,
Oh, yeah.
Operation Market Garden.
Right.
This was a pivotal World War II operation led by General Eisenhower in 1944, and you sent us some intriguing research by Lieutenant Colonel James V. Schultz,
Okay.
analyzing it through the lens of something called prospect theory.
It's a fascinating concept.
That was it.
Really.
Okay.
Prospect theory helps explain how our perception of risk changes depending on whether we feel like we're winning or losing.
Oh, okay.
It gets at the psychology behind decision-making, especially when the stakes are high.
So it's not just about weighing pros and cons logically. There's an emotional element too.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Imagine it like this. You're playing poker and you've been on a winning streak.
Yeah.
You're more likely to play conservatively, right?
Yeah.
Protect
Careful
those
game.
gains. But if you've been losing, you might get desperate and take bigger risks to try and recover.
Okay, I can see that. So are we saying Eisenhower was feeling the heat and made a rash decision?
Not necessarily. To understand his mindset, we need to set the stage.
Okay.
It's September 1944, just months after D-Day. The Allies are pushing back the Germans, but things are getting complicated.
Right. I remember from the source materials that their supply lines were stretched thin, relying on the distant port of Cherbourg.
Yeah,
And they desperately needed Antwerp, but it was still under German control.
exactly.
Yeah.
Plus, the Germans, while retreating, were digging in along the Siegfried Line, a heavily fortified defensive barrier. So there was this sense of urgency,
Right.
but also growing awareness of the challenges ahead.
And this is where Operation Market Garden comes in.
Yes.
A bold plan to capture a series of bridges in Holland, ultimately aiming to secure a crossing over the Rhine River at Arnhem.
A daring move championed by Field Marshal Montgomery.
Okay.
It had the potential to outflank the Siegfried Line, open a path into Germany, maybe even shorten the war. It would also help protect England from those terrifying V-2 rocket attacks.
Sounds like a high-risk, high-reward situation, but I'm guessing the risks were pretty substantial too, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
They were relying on multiple airborne drops deep behind enemy lines, stretched over 3 days. No element of surprise there.
Yeah.
Plus, their tank advance was limited to a narrow, single-file road,
Oh, wow.
making them incredibly vulnerable.
And as you mentioned, the source material suggests that intelligence reports indicated stronger German defenses than initially anticipated, especially near that key bridge at Arnhem.
All of this raises the question, was Eisenhower a rational actor, objectively weighing the pros and cons? Or was his decision-making influenced by this prospect theory idea?
Meaning, did the context, those potential losses looming large, push him towards a riskier choice than he might have made in a different situation? Let's dive into that. We know that just a few months before Market Garden, Eisenhower had advocated for a broad front approach to the Allied advance. Steady, methodical, not exactly the hallmark of a gambler.
That's an excellent point. This is where understanding the nuances of prospect theory becomes crucial. It's not simply about being risk-averse or risk-seeking. It's about how our perception of potential gains and losses shifts our tolerance for risk.
So Eisenhower, the cautious strategist, might have become more willing to gamble when faced with the possibility of losing the momentum they'd fought so hard to achieve.
Precisely. What's fascinating about prospect theory is that it suggests that the pain of a potential loss looms larger in our minds than the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
So even if the odds of success for Market Garden were slim, the potential losses of not attempting it, a prolonged war, continued. V-2 attacks on England, mounting pressure from the British might have felt far more significant to Eisenhower.
Exactly. And here's where the political context adds another layer to this whole equation.
Okay, let's talk politics. The source material hinted at some tension between the Allied powers, right?
Absolutely. The British were pushing for a swift end to the war, especially with those V-2 rockets raining down on them. But the Americans now, a dominant force, had their own strategic interests and wanted to assert their leadership.
So Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, was caught in the middle of this tug-of-war. Did he greenlight Market Garden, a plan championed by the British, as a concession? Was he swayed by Montgomery's confidence, or perhaps even his own evolving perception of risk?
It's a complex puzzle. But by applying prospect theory, we can start to piece together the factors that might have tipped the scales in favor of such a daring and ultimately tragic operation.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
We've laid the groundwork, we know the context, the stakes, and the theoretical framework. Now let's see how this all played out in the heat of battle.
All right.
All right, so we've got this backdrop of mounting pressure and potential losses influencing Eisenhower's mindset. But how did Operation Market Garden actually unfold? What happened when theory met reality?
Well, as you can imagine, it was a chaotic scene.
Oh, yeah.
Thousands of Allied paratroopers descending from the sky.
I bet.
Gliders landing amidst enemy territory. A massive ground operation trying to punch through to link up with them.
I can only imagine the logistical nightmare of coordinating something this complex.
It was a monumental undertaking.
Yeah.
The operation was divided into several phases,
Okay.
each with its own objectives and challenges.
And you mentioned earlier that there were some initial successes, right?
Yes, at first things seemed to be going according to plan. The American 101st Airborne Division managed to secure a couple of key bridges south of Eindhoven.
That must have been a huge relief, seeing at least part of the plan working.
Indeed. And further north, the 82nd Airborne secured the bridge at Grave relatively quickly. However, Nijmegen proved to be a much tougher nut to crack. They faced fierce resistance from the Germans.
But what about the British 1st Airborne? They were tasked with securing that crucial bridge at Arnhem, the ultimate objective of the whole operation.
That's where things took a turn for the worse. Remember those intelligence reports suggesting stronger German defenses than initially thought?
Oh yeah, the ones that were downplayed or perhaps viewed through a lens clouded by the desire for a quick victory.
Precisely. Well, it turned out to be even worse than anticipated. Elements of 2 SS Panzer divisions were in the area refitting after the fighting in Normandy.
Talk about bad timing. So the British paratroopers expecting lighter resistance suddenly found themselves facing battle-hardened panzer units.
Exactly. Despite their incredible bravery, the 1st Airborne was outnumbered and outgunned. They were essentially trapped in a cauldron of intense fighting.
And what about the ground forces, that single-file tank column trying to push north to relieve them?
They were facing a brutal slog.
Oh, wow.
The narrow roads, coupled with determined German resistance, meant they were advancing at a snail's pace. The terrain itself worked against them, too.
Right. I remember reading in the source material about how the soft soil in some areas made it difficult for the tanks to maneuver. Not exactly ideal for a rapid advance.
Not at all. So you have this desperate situation unfolding. The paratroopers at Arnhem clinging on for dear life, waiting for reinforcements that were agonizingly slow to arrive.
Yeah. And as we know, those reinforcements never made it in time. The bridge at Arnhem remained in German hands, and the operation ultimately failed.
It was a devastating blow for the Allies. They suffered heavy casualties, and the operation's failure had far-reaching consequences.
So what happened in the aftermath? How did this impact the war, and perhaps more importantly for our discussion, how did it reflect on Eisenhower's decision-making?
Well, first and foremost, it meant that Antwerp, that crucial port, remained in German hands for longer than anticipated. The failure to secure a Rhine crossing also prolonged the war, adding to the already immense human and material cost.
And what about the morale aspect? You mentioned earlier that the operation was seen as a potential game changer, a path to a swift victory.
Absolutely. When it failed, it had a significant impact on Allied morale. You can imagine the sense of disappointment, the feeling that victory, once seemingly so close, had slipped through their fingers.
A bitter pill to swallow after so much sacrifice and effort.
It also gave the Germans a much-needed boost. They had successfully repelled a major Allied offensive, proving they were far from defeated.
A propaganda victory as much as a military one. But how did all of this play into the analysis of Eisenhower's decision-making? Did the failure validate the concerns of those who saw Market Garden as too risky?
It certainly raised questions about the decision-making process. Looking back, some historians and military analysts argue that the operation was fundamentally flawed,
Yeah.
that the risks were simply too great, and that perhaps Eisenhower had allowed himself to be swayed by overly optimistic assessments.
Maybe that sense of impending loss, that fear of the war dragging on amplified by the pressure from the British, had clouded his judgment?
That's certainly one interpretation through the lens of prospect theory. Perhaps he overweighted the potential gains and downplayed the very real risks.
We've talked about the military and strategic implications, but you mentioned earlier that there was a political dimension to all of this as well. How did the failure of Market Garden impact the delicate balance of power within the Allied coalition?
It definitely strained relations. The British were understandably disappointed. They had championed the plan, and its failure put them in a difficult position.
Especially since they had been so vocal about the need for a swift victory to relieve the pressure on England.
Exactly. And the Americans, while sympathetic, may have felt a sense of vindication. Their concerns about the operation's risks, their preference for a broader, more cautious approach, seemed to be validated by the outcome.
So a strategic setback with political ripples. It seems like Operation Market Garden, even in its failure, provides a fascinating case study for understanding how complex decisions are made in the crucible of war.
It certainly does. And by applying prospect theory, we can gain valuable insights into the psychological factors that might have influenced Eisenhower's thinking. But remember, this isn't just ancient history.
Right.
These same principles apply to the decisions we make every day in all aspects of our lives.
Okay, I'm ready to bring this down to earth a bit. How can we, as ordinary people, apply these insights from Operation Market Garden and prospect theory to our own lives? So we've been talking about this big historical event, but you're saying that the same psychological forces that might have influenced Eisenhower's decision-making during Operation Market Garden are at play in our everyday lives.
Absolutely. Think about it. We're constantly making decisions big and small that involve risk and uncertainty.
Right.
Prospect theory gives us a framework for understanding how our perception of those risks can be swayed by whether we feel like we're in a winning or losing position.
Okay, give me a real-world example, something I can relate to.
Let's say you're thinking about investing in a new stock.
Yeah.
You've heard some buzz, it's doing well, and you're tempted to jump in. But then the market takes a dip, and suddenly that same stock looks a lot riskier.
Yeah, I've definitely felt that pull to hold off when things start to feel shaky.
That's prospect theory in action. When we perceive ourselves to be in a domain of gains, like when the market is up, we tend to be more risk averse. We're happy with our winnings and don't want to jeopardize them.
But when things start going south, we might get more reckless.
Exactly. In the domain of losses, like a market downturn, we become more risk-seeking. We're willing to take bigger gambles to try and recover our losses, even if those gambles aren't necessarily the most rational choices.
So it's like that feeling of, I've already lost this much, what's a little more?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's where understanding prospect theory can be so powerful. It helps us recognize these biases in ourselves and make more conscious, informed decisions.
So it's not about eliminating risk altogether. It's about being aware of how our perception of risk might be skewed in a given moment.
Exactly. Think about another everyday example. You're driving to work and you hit a lot of red lights. Frustrating, right? Prospect theory suggests that in that moment of frustration, you might be more likely to make a risky move, like speeding up to try and make the next light, even though it's probably not the safest choice.
Okay, now you're making me self-conscious about my morning commute.
But that's the point. By being aware of these psychological tendencies, we can make more conscious choices. In that driving scenario, recognizing your frustration and choosing to stay calm and follow the rules could be the difference between a close call and a safe arrival.
So prospect theory is like a mental tool we can use to calibrate our decision-making process.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about big life choices like investments or career moves. It can apply to even seemingly small decisions.
Like what? Give me another example.
Imagine you're in a store trying to decide between two pairs of jeans. You like them both equally, but one is on sale. Prospect theory suggests you're more likely to buy the sale pair, even if it means sacrificing something you might prefer about the other pair, simply because you feel like you're getting a gain.
Because we're programmed to avoid that feeling of loss, even if it's just a perceived loss of a good deal.
Exactly. And understanding this can help you make choices that truly align with your needs and preferences, rather than being swayed by these unconscious biases.
So what's the takeaway here? What's the practical advice for our listeners who want to apply prospect theory to their own lives?
I'd say the first step is awareness. Recognize that your perception of risk is fluid. It changes depending on the context and your emotional state. When you're faced with a decision, take a moment to step back and ask yourself,
Am I feeling pressured? Am I afraid of losing something? Is that influencing my judgment?
exactly. And don't be afraid to challenge your initial instincts. If you find yourself drawn to a risky choice, ask yourself if it's truly the best option, or if you're being swayed by the fear of missing out or the desire to recover a loss.
So it's about taking that extra beat, that pause to assess the situation objectively.
Exactly. Remember, the goal isn't to become completely risk-averse. Calculated risks lead to great rewards, but by understanding how our brains are wired to respond to gains and losses, we can make more conscious, informed choices that lead to better outcomes.
This has been fascinating. I feel like I have a whole new lens for looking at not just historical events, but also my own decisions going forward.
And who knows? Maybe this awareness will help you avoid a market garden of your own.
I'll certainly try. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. Until next time.